Hey guys, how you doing? It's Mr. Lawniczak again. This is DBQ video number 2. Few things today. This video is a little bit longer than the first one. I tried my best to shorten it, but I go further with you. So this is going to go through 4 documents. The DBQ today that you need to get out is the August of 2008 DBQ. You also need, again, your 3 highlighters, pink, yellow, and green. You need your pen, and you need to have a blank sheet of paper to compose your graphic organizer. Again, this video is about 28, more like 29 minutes long. We're going to go through 4 documents together. Take your time, go slowly. Again, we're coming close to the regions, and here we go. This DBQ we're going to do is a little trickier than the first one, so stick with me as we go through it. The first thing you do every time you look at your DBQ is read the historical context, and we'll do that here together. It says, throughout history, migrations of people have affected countries and regions. These migrations have been both voluntary and involuntary, and include Africans to the Americas, Jews to Palestine and Israel, and Hindus, Muslims between India and Pakistan. So right there you have it. You have your 3 groups. You have Africans to the Americas, Jews to Palestine and Israel, Hindus, Muslims between India and Pakistan. Right off the bat, you should know the one we focused on most in class this year is Hindus, Muslims between India and Pakistan. The other 2, you focused on, one in 9th grade, one we haven't talked about yet. That might happen on the final exam, so stick with me as we go through this DBQ. Now, after that, after you get an understanding of the historical context, read the task. This is the most important part of the day. So, using the information from the documents and your knowledge of global history, answer the questions that follow each document in Part A. Your answers to the questions will help you write the Part B essay in which you will be asked to select 2 migrations mentioned in the historical context, and for each of them, you have to describe the historical circumstances surrounding the voluntary or involuntary migration, and for 2 of them, for each of them, you need to discuss an impact the migration had on the country or region from which the group left, and or an impact the migration had on the new destination. I want to bring your attention to and or for a minute. When you see this, assume and. A good writer is going to give me both. A sloppy writer, a slacker, is going to just do one. So if you see and or, just assume it's and. That's a really good point of reference. So again, you're writing about 2 of the 3 migrations mentioned in the historical context. Africans to the Americas, Jews to Palestine and Israel, Hindus, Muslims between India and Pakistan. So read that as much as you need to, get a feel for it, and then when you're ready, go ahead and set up your graphic organizer. We'll do that together here. I've actually already got it started for you, so you might need to pause this, but I'll briefly go through the system again. You're writing about 2 migrations. So usually I teach you the phrase F the 2, but we modify it and we do E the 3 first. So we want to create a graphic organizer like this with each of the 3 groups right here that I'm just kind of highlighting here randomly in the left-hand margin. And again, you're getting these groups, Africans, Jews, and Hindus, Muslims, you're getting that from the historical context right here in which I bracketed. These are your groups that you need to write about. And again, you're only writing about 2, but we're graphing all 3, and I think you know why. It's to understand which 2 of the 3 you feel most comfortable about when it comes time to write the essay. So go ahead and write those down the left-hand side. Then you need to draw a line down the middle, as I've already done, of your graphic organizer, and leave a space on the top for each of the 2 bullets. And that I'm going to go ahead here and write in with you. So the first bullet says, describe the historical circumstances surrounding the migration. So we'll go ahead and write that in together. I'm going to write down describe historical circumstances surrounding the migration. Remember, migration means to move to another place, like birds moving south for the winter. They're migrating. So that's your first bullet. Second bullet says, and this is the real tricky one, discuss an impact the migration had on the country or region from which the group left, and or an impact the migration had on the new destination. So notice, you're not discussing the impact on people, you're discussing the impact on the country or region. So that's very important. You're going to discuss where they left. So how did Africans going to the Americas, how did that affect or impact Africa, the continent, or the Americas? That's what you need to do here. So we're going to go ahead and write that in right now up on the top left. So it's discuss impact of migration on the region, the group left, and or, again I want you to do and, the group left and or the new destination. Go ahead and write that in, pause if you need to. Again, it's important you fully understand what your essay needs to focus on. If you're not going to write about that correctly, you're going to suffer when it comes down to your essay getting graded. So make sure you have your graphic organizer set up. Then you're ready to go ahead and start answering the documents. We're going to do the first 4 documents together today. But before we do that, I want to go ahead and just, again, review highlighters with you. Make sure you have your pink, your yellow, and your green highlighters with you. We're going to be highlighting multiple colors as we go through this. So now let's go ahead and get started. The first document here. Again, when you go through the documents, you want to have your pink highlighter in hand and you want to read the question first. Question 1 says, according to Franklin and Moss, what was one reason enslaved Africans were imported to the New World by Europeans? In case you don't remember, New World means the Americas. So, what was one reason enslaved Africans were imported to the New World? So, after you understand the question, read the document. It says, the big business of slave trading. And you're looking to highlight important things as you go. I'll read along. When in 1517, Bishop Bartolomeo de las Casas supported the encouragement of migration to the New World by permitting Spaniards to import African slaves, the trading of humans in the New World formally began. Las Casas was also determined to relieve Indians of the onerous or difficult burden of slavery that he recommended the enslavement of Africans. I'm going to stop there for a minute because that's your answer. That sentence right there tells you one reason Africans were imported to the New World. It says, Las Casas, who is a person, was so determined to relieve the Indians of the onerous or difficult burden of slavery that he recommended the enslavement of Africans. I'm going to stop there for right now, and I'm going to go ahead and word for word, I'm going to copy that down because that is the answer to the question. So the answer says, Las Casas, I don't know why that's not in there. Las Casas was determined to relieve the Indians of the burden, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, of slavery. And there's your answer. Again, that's just modified directly from the document. And that's bothering me. That needs to be in there. Sorry about that. So there's your answer. Now we need to ask ourselves the question down below, so what? So, because Africans are now being imported to the New World and Indians are no longer slaves, what's going on? What's the so what here? What's an impact of this? Well, just think about it for a minute. If Africans are leaving Africa and they're being forced into slavery, Africans began being used as slaves. So that's a very general one, but that works. Africans began to be used as slaves in the New World. Okay, what do you think slavery has led to? Again, just think kind of critically here. This is something you've learned about a lot in social studies. What has slavery led to? So what? Slavery of Africans has led to racism in the New World. There's no doubt about it. This is something that everybody should be able to understand, that this was an impact of racism in the New World as Africans were being kind of forced into slavery. Now, what we can do here is if we have any outside information, we can add it. If there's something you remember about the slave trade, go ahead and add that down here. One thing here we got to do before that, though, is actually go back and highlight the so what in yellow. So these are good things to use when we write our essay. Go ahead and highlight that in yellow. And now you're ready to go ahead and think about any outside information. What do you remember about the African slave trade? One thing that might pop up is something called triangular trade. Triangle trade was the term for the slave trade. That was a term where the Europeans went to Africa and bought slaves, and then they sent those Africans to the New World, where they would be put onto plantations and produce products that were sent back to Africa. And we will review that at the end of the year here, but that could be a piece of outside information that you remember. Another thing you could remember is one part of the triangular trade that was absolutely horrible was called the Middle Passage. Middle Passage was the journey of Africans who were enslaved to the New World, meaning the Americas, across the Atlantic Ocean. And they were treated horribly on this. Several Europeans brutalized Africans on the Middle Passage. Several Africans enslaved were in terrible conditions and died from terrible diseases, so you could include some of those things. Terrible conditions for Africans on this journey. Again, this might help you when you write your essay. This is considered outside information. It's not very specific, but it's specific enough. So we want to highlight this because this is very, very good information. You want to highlight this in green. So this is the triangular trade, the Middle Passage. Now, we're done with document 1. You could go back and you could read more and highlight more in pink in your document if you so desired. But right now what we're going to do is go to our graphic organizer and think about where this corresponds. Does this discuss the impact on the area? Not so much, but it does describe historical circumstances. So we're going to write down Doc 1 in our graphic organizer. So that does it for document number 1. Let's move on to document 2. Same method here. We want to get our pink highlighter in hand before we write. Read the question first with your pink highlighter in hand. It says, question 2, according to Willie F. Page, what was one impact of the arrival of Africans on Brazil and on the Caribbean islands? So here's that word impact. So, I mean, even if we wanted to, we know we're talking about impact. We could already put Doc 2 right here. You know, there's no doubt you can go out of order like that. But now let's go ahead and read the question together. Actually, not the question, the document. We're looking for an impact of the arrival of Africans on Brazil and the Caribbean islands. So document 2 starts out reading together. Large-scale sugar plantations, established first in Brazil and after 1645 in the Caribbean islands, were enormously profitable. That means they made a lot of money. Plantations in Cuba gave more than a 30% return on capital investment. Those in Barbados returned 40 to 50%. So they're giving you a lot of data right here. These are numbers you could use when you write your essay. These islands became societies whose economies relied heavy on the labor of African captives. In 1789, 1/3 of the population of Cuba was comprised of Africans. I'm pretty sure that's a good impact. That's a good date, too. 1789, 1/3 of the population of Cuba was comprised of Africans. That means 1 out of every 3 people living in Cuba was of African descent. Between 1730 and 1834, up to 90% of the populations of Jamaica, Antigua, and Grenada were Africans. So you're getting some stats here about how Africans were making up a large percentage of the islands in the Caribbean, like Jamaica. Then finally, Brazil in 1800 has half the population being African. So it's giving you some statistics that Africans made up a huge proportion of the islands in the Caribbean and of Brazil. So there's your answer. Anything highlighted there, word for word, basically can give you the answer. So I'm going to write down in 1789, the first thing I wrote down here, 1789, 1/3 of the population of Cuba was comprised, that means made up of Africans. You could go on and you could write more. There's no doubt that that's not a bad thing to do, but this does give me the answer. So you have your answer, you have some good information highlighted here. Now the next step you want to do is underneath the question is you want to write down, so what? How is this going to impact a society? How is this going to impact Brazil and Brazil and the Caribbean? If you have a whole bunch of people from African descent that are enslaved living in these areas, what might that do to the culture? Do you think the culture of Brazil or the Caribbean will stay the same, or do you think it will change because people from Africa are coming over in huge amounts? Well, if you think about it, it's obviously going to change. So you can say that the culture of Brazil and the Caribbean will be altered with large amounts of Africans now enslaved there. Now again, I'm just doing this with you right here, so that's why I'm taking a little time. Okay, think about other things other than culture. Will anything else change now that you have a huge proportion of slaves living somewhere else? Obviously, what else might change? If you write down so what, something else that might change, so what? The economies will change. In fact, if we go back to the document, they give you some stats on that. Okay, the plantations, the sugar plantations, were enormously profitable. So who's going to make money from this? Who's going to make money from slavery? Think about that for a minute. So what? If it's enormously profitable, are slaves making money? Obviously not. So what? We can say plantation owners are making huge amounts of money. Plantation owners will make huge profits from slavery. And that is an effect, that is an impact of slavery on the New World. So there you go, you have so what right there. Any outside information here, if you can think of, go ahead and add it. But before that, make sure you pick up your yellow highlighter and highlight anything you've written down based on a so what. Again, I can't stress how important this is. You're a visual learner whether or not you think you are. So highlighting things is showing you it's good, and when you're looking to include info in your essay, you're going to include this information. At least that's what I want you to do. That's how you're going to get a good score. So document 2, I'm going to move on to here, and we're going to go to document 3. Pick up your pink highlighter. And as you have your pink highlighter in hand, once again, read the question. So question 3 says, based on this excerpt from Africa in Encyclopedia for Students, state the 2 effects of the slave trade on Africa. So you're looking for 2 effects of the slave trade on Africa. And with your highlighter in hand, you want to go through and highlight key information that you can use. So together again, we'll read long-term effects. The trade in African slaves brought the largest forced movement of people in history. That's important information, a large forced movement of people in history. It established the basis for black populations in the Caribbean and in North and South America. That's good information right there. At the same time, it disrupted social and political life in Africa and opened the door for European colonization of the continent. That's good information right there. Let's keep reading though, because it's never a bad idea to read. This information is there for you to use. Keeping on here, it says, the shift in European demand for gold, foodstuffs, and such products to slaves changed the relationship among African groups and states. The prices Africans received for slaves made it more profitable for them to take captives from their neighbors than to establish networks for producing and selling other goods. This is important right here. Because remember, Africans were involved in this slave trade as well. Europeans paid African tribal groups to actually round up slaves for them. And if you read what you highlighted here, the prices Africans received for slaves made it more profitable for them to take captives than to establish networks for trade and selling other goods. So that's something we're going to come back to. You can go on, and it goes, in this way the slave trade encouraged strong states to raid weaker states for slaves. As a result, many African societies were torn by organized slave wars and general banditry. Successful slave trade raiding and trading societies formed new states that were dominated by military groups and constantly at war with their neighbors. So there's a ton of information here. Now, maybe you picked this up, maybe you didn't, but if you read this question carefully, this is a tricky question. The question asks you to state 2 effects of the slave trade on Africa. The key there is on Africa. So if you took information about how it was an impact on the Caribbean or on Brazil, you're not going to get a point. You need to choose information about how the slave trade affected Africa. And that's mainly in the second paragraph. So the 2 things I'm going to choose here and that I want you to write down is that you could write down how African societies were torn by organized slave wars and banditry. That means, banditry means bandits taking advantage of people, robbing. Think about almost like pirates, but you're not on the ocean. So banditry. The other one here we can write down that I'm going to choose, again, there's several answers here, but the one I'm going to choose that I think is good is the last thing I wrote down there. New states that were dominated by military groups and constantly at war with their neighbors. New states were dominated by military groups and constantly at war. So there's your two answers you should have right there. And what you need to do now down below is answer a so what. So if African societies were torn by organized slave wars and banditry, how is that going to impact them? What do you think that's going to lead to? Is that going to help their society? Is that going to hurt their society? It's obviously going to hurt their society, so you can write down that African society was negatively affected by the slave trade. Okay, there's a lot more information here you're going to have to kind of think of critically right here. Another so what you could write down. The economies of Africa will suffer. If you're taking away a huge percentage of your population, that's not going to be good at all. So you could say economies and governments will suffer due to the slave trade. Another so what. If you go and you look at the first paragraph right here, it disrupted social and political life in Africa and opened the door for European colonization of the continent. That's imperialism. That's talking about the reasons for imperialism. We could come to that in a little bit as well. The other thing you could look at and maybe come up with a so what for is the one I'm kind of highlighting over here. The prices Africans received for slaves made it more profitable for them to take captives from their neighbors than to establish networks for trade. So what's that going to do for cultural diffusion? If you're not setting up trade routes, are you going to have as much cultural diffusion? No. So you could say the slave trade hurt cultural diffusion in Africa. And anytime you can use cultural diffusion in a DBQ is good. So always think about cultural diffusion, think about the economy, think about war. These are good so whats. Okay? So we have three good so whats right here, and we want to go ahead and highlight all three of those in yellow. And then try to think about some outside information here. What do you know about Africa? What do you know about, it mentioned colonialism, or another word for colonialism is imperialism. So a few things come to mind off the top of my head. So some additional outside information. What happened with imperialism? Why did it happen? You could write about the 3 M's. You could write about money markets and raw materials. Those are the reasons for imperialism. You could write about white man's burden. White man's burden was the idea that Europeans felt responsible to educate Africans. This all came from the slave trade. That's what this document's trying to tell you. Or you could write about the Berlin Conference. These are things you could hopefully include somehow in your essay. Maybe, maybe not. This, again, is a difficult DBQ. But these are things that come to the top of my head when I'm thinking about imperialism and Africa. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to highlight these things in green, and maybe I'm going to be able to work them into my essay. So 3 down, 1 to go. Let's do this one together. 4A and 4B go together. So these two documents are on the same page, and 4A is a chart here. Here now we're moving on to Jews, and the Jews moving to Israel and Palestine. So you look at a chart here and a timeline here. Let's go ahead and read the question together, and you should pick up your pink highlighter. Question 4 says, based on these documents, identify 2 specific reasons large numbers of Jewish immigrants moved to Palestine-Israel region between 1920 and 1970. So you're looking for 2 specific reasons. Now this one is a little tricky. This chart, to be honest with you, doesn't give you too much information. This gives you numbers in thousands of Jews moving. So this is giving you numbers, the percentages, how many Jews moved in each year to Israel or Palestine. but we're looking for reasons. The numbers don't give you the reasons. There's nothing here that gives you a reason. So the reasons have to come from this timeline. Now, basically, to be honest with you, anything from this timeline is going to give you the right answer. If you think about Jews and Jews migrating, why would Jews leave their homeland? The first word that popped out to me when I looked at this was Hitler. Okay, Hitler rises to power in 1933. Why do you think Jews might leave when Hitler rises to power? You should know that. Okay, we'll come back to that later. Also something called Kristallnacht in Germany that has to do with the Holocaust. Again, Jews kind of being persecuted. And the final solution, again, part of Hitler and the Nazi Holocaust, is implemented in 1941. So these are three answers right here that would work in this essay. So I'm going to write down two of the three. I'm going to write down Hitler rose to power in 1933. Might as well include the year if you have it. And the second document, or rather the second answer I'm going to write down is I'm going to write down the one about the final solution. Final solution implemented in 1941. So those are two answers. Honestly, any one of the other ones would have worked as well. You could go back to the chart and kind of look at years. For instance, 1949 was a year Jews moved. 1935 was a year that spiked up with Jews moving to Israel or Palestine. But again, you should have your two answers here. Now you want to try to rack your brain for a so what. So what? So Hitler rose to power. Let's try to think about that. What do you remember about Adolf Hitler? The thing you all remember is that he hated Jews. Okay, so because Adolf Hitler rose to power, so what? Jews in Germany, and that's outside information. This is a little bit of green worked into the yellow together. Jews in Germany felt scared for their well-being. If you were a Jew in Germany and you heard the things Adolf Hitler was saying, I don't know about you, I probably would have felt scared. So Jews in Germany felt scared for their well-being. Okay. Any other so what's right here? So what? So Jews that were able to move or migrate out of Germany might leave. Again, if you heard the things Adolf Hitler was saying and you were aware of them, if you were aware of this thing Kristallnacht, which means night of broken glass, that's when all of the Jews had their homes smashed and destroyed, and then the Jewish buildings were destroyed, that might have prompted them to leave. So they might leave. Now, go ahead and highlight that in yellow. And let's try to think of some outside information. Some outside information here on the Jews and on Hitler in general is a ton. You can write all about Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, so you can include things about the Nazi Party. Nazi Party, what was some of their ideas? You could write about anti-Semitism. What I actually want you to do here as I wrap this up with you, I'm not going to give you any more outside information. I think this is a good place to stop for now. I want you, as your homework, to think of some outside information about Jews and Hitler and Germany, things you could include in this essay. And the other thing I want you to do as you come to class next day, tomorrow, is to go ahead and answer document 5 in this same method. So read the question for document 5A, highlight important information, and give me a so what. I know I didn't do too much more with the graphic organizer. It might not be a bad idea to go back and do that as well. But again, I am expecting you to complete document 5 in this same method and also give me a little bit more green here for document 4B. Try to include some extra stuff here. Okay? So again, if you have any questions, get a hold of me. If not, good luck, and I'll talk to you later.